Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gapesta here. This is the Normal and Heroic raid guide for Blackhand, the final boss in Blackrock Foundry, and of course last boss of the tier. Now before we get into the guide itself, you can skip ahead if you want, but just a personal note, I really enjoyed this fight quite a lot, and I think one of the most exciting things is it's the first sort of in-zone or in-tier boss that we've seen in a long time that does not try to derive its difficulty from an exceptionally long fight length. This fight proves that you don't need to have a long fight in duration, with sort of monotony mixed in to make something challenging. This is a very short encounter, probably around 7 minutes for your first kill, but it's plenty difficult. There's enough going on to make it interesting, and I just found its design was very interesting, very well done. So props to Blizzard. Hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. Anyway, let's get started with the actual guide. For your raid composition, nothing too out of the ordinary. 2 tanks, 4 to 6 healers, depending on your raid size and comfort levels. For DPS, a good mixture is perfectly fine. You will find a bit of an advantage in the second phase if you have classes that are capable of strong burst or non-targeted area of effect spells for the balcony phase. So for example, balanced druids, death knights, rogues, maybe DPS warriors to some degree, stuff like that can do high DPS burst to a number of small targets. But otherwise, it's not going to matter. A mix of ranged and melee is perfectly fine. The other big consideration is paladins. If you can bring extra paladins, that will help you a great deal with one of the main mechanics, which is Mark for Death and Impaling Throw combinations, particularly in the final phase. Again, not necessary or absolutely required, but it will assist you with cooldowns that paladins have available that they can cast on other people. Now, as we loop back to the beginning, we'll talk about the core abilities in this fight. What's interesting about the design is that this encounter takes on just a few fundamental mechanics, but then expands upon them throughout the encounter to make them more difficult to deal with, which I really enjoy anyway. So the first of these is Marked for Death, and in conjunction with that, the Impaling Throw ability. These things are probably the most important mechanic to get used to, that the majority of the raid will have to deal with throughout the fight. So Marked for Death will target 2 random ranged players, so any ranged DPS or non-monk healer. After 5 seconds, the boss will throw or Impaling Throw toward that player's location and hit the first target that the throw actually touches. So it can be the player that's targeted that it's going toward, or it can be someone else that happens to be standing in line of sight between that player and the boss. You'll also notice that the players receive these skull markers on their head, and the boss has arrows emanating from his body that will show the current location of those players. So the directionality that the throw will actually go toward. Now during the 5-second period before the throw occurs, the debuffed players will have increased movement speed, so they can get around a little bit faster. But the general idea of this mechanic throughout the first and second phases, at least, is to try to block the throw effect using some other ability. And so this ability will just depend on the phase that you're doing. For example, in this first phase, players are hiding behind these piles of debris on the ground. And this will essentially block line of sight and negate the actual throw effect from hitting the initial targets. If the throw does hit you, it does pretty heavy initial physical damage, as well as applies a 45-second dot debuff. This debuff does very heavy damage. It's extremely difficult to heal through, and we'll talk more about this in Phase 2 when you have to deal with it. But the basic idea is that you want to eliminate as many of these debuffs from going out as possible, as many of the dots as possible, so that you don't have to actually deal with the healing required for them. And so by blocking the throws and thus the hit, you block the dot. It's worth noting that you can use some form of immunity, such as personal immunity, hand of protection, stuff like that, to block the initial Impaling Throw hit, which also prevents a knockback effect from hitting you, but you cannot block the dot damage from it. So this is a critical thing to keep in mind as we talk about Phase 2, but more importantly, Phase 3. You can stop the initial hit and the knockback, but you cannot prevent the dot. So if a player is getting hit, the dot is always active. The second core ability is Slag Bombs, and in conjunction, the Slagged debuff. So Slag Bombs throughout most of the fight will be cast by the boss in a pattern of 3 around his current location. So you can kind of see a few of them in the back of the camera there. So these bombs, once dropped, will activate after a few seconds. And once activated, anyone that steps on top of them within about the 3-yard radius that they activate will cause an explosion. This explosion is a 10-yard radius, and it will hit anyone within the radius for pretty heavy damage, but probably more importantly will apply the Slagged debuff. Slagged lasts for 15 seconds and increases all damage taken by 100% for that 15-second duration. So, while generally this may not kill a single individual, depending on what else is happening around the fight and what other damage sources you have, that will certainly be a problem. So one of the most important things is that your entire raid can learn is how to properly avoid triggering these slag bombs when you don't need to. The final core ability is Shattering Smash, and this is cast fairly infrequently on the current tank of the boss, so whoever has threat on the boss at the time. This is a sort of circular melee attack, so it will target the tank's current location with that player being the center of the circular attack radius, and anyone within that circle, including the tank that was targeted, will be knocked away. What's interesting about the knockaway mechanic is that while the targeted tank will always be knocked backwards relative to where the boss was facing toward them, anyone that's in the circle with the tank will be knocked in a direction opposite where the center tank location is. So, for example, if you are directly in line with the boss and behind the tank, you will be knocked straight back away from the boss. But if you are in front of the tank, between the tank and the boss, you'll be knocked forward. And sort of, as you can imagine, if you're on the left side of the tank, you'll be knocked left, and so on. So this allows you to force yourself to be knocked in directions that you want to go. And this is relevant in Phase 2 and particularly in Phase 3. The basic idea of Shattering Smash is that it does moderate damage, split among all people that are inside the radius of the effect. So the tank that's targeted, and then anyone else that's inside it as well will split this damage. It'll also be knocked away, as mentioned, the tank directly backwards from the boss, and then anyone else in the direction that they are relative to the tank's position. So now that we've covered the core mechanics, we can go through the phases, being a 3-phase fight, and talk about the intricacies and any additional effects you'll have to deal with. So the first up is in Phase 1, we have Molten Slag. You'll notice shortly into the fight, the outside edge of the room will start to be covered by this Molten Slag effect. And throughout the first phase, this will creep closer and closer to the center, eventually covering the entire room and acting as a very soft, but technically soft and rage mechanic. If you touch this, you will take very heavy damage with a stacking debuff that will apply more and more damage over time very rapidly. So this sort of limits your space as the phase goes on. In addition to that, you'll notice that when the boss casts his slag bombs, as mentioned, they come down in a pattern of 3 around his location. However, when the molten slag that's seeping closer will touch the edge of a slag bomb, it will cause it to explode. So this is a critical thing to note and will sort of force your tank and melee movement around the room. So as you're moving from the outside, you're going closer and closer toward the center so that the fresh bombs that spawn do not get triggered and therefore explode on melee or tank players from the slag that's coming in. Now, Demolition is the new ability that you'll see that's not a core mechanic on this phase. And this allows you to deal with the Marked for Death and Impaling Throw mechanic in Phase 1, essentially. The basic idea is that the boss will enter sort of a sub-phase during Phase 1, where he will start to use Demolition. And this will cause a series of demolition debris falls to come down from the ceiling and target player locations or nearby player locations. So there are a series of smaller demolitions that look like little brown circles, and these don't target actual player locations, but they're nearby. These do moderate damage, but not too severe, and you can mitigate the damage by being further away from the point that they dropped on. However, more importantly, you'll also get a set of 3, one after the other, of the massive demolitions, which will look like larger orange circles when they fall. These actually target the location of a random ranged player. And after a few seconds when they fall, they do a huge amount of damage, again, lessened by the further distance you are from their drop location. Now, because these massive ones target the location of ranged players, you can permanently and purposely dictate where those debris falls are coming down, where the massive debris are actually falling, and lessen the damage you take, but more importantly, position them where you want. Now, I should mention that many raids will not really bother with this, and they will just sort of spread out and do their best to avoid damage on a personal level, but I don't really recommend it. And the problem is that if you do that sort of spread method versus a method that tries to control the damage somewhat in the positioning, you will take roughly double the damage from these hits, and it's a huge amount, requires a lot more cooldowns and whatnot to deal with, and it's just random. It also will be problematic for controlling their impaling throws, because players that are targeted will not necessarily be near the same debris pile, and therefore hiding behind different ones, which is inefficient, not something you want. So, as we restart here, you can see what we try to do, which worked pretty well, is have the range group start on the far right side of the boss, so max range essentially. When demolition starts, you can see the first massive demolition, the orange, targets someone there, and then we start running across to the left. The second one will target when we're about halfway across, and then the third one will come down shortly after that. And I think there we had our Paladin, I believe, Paladin Healer, who just bubbles himself and stays in the middle, so he got targeted with the third one, which is fine. But the idea is that one will be in the far right, then the second one in the middle, then the next one left. And then by doing this, the actual landing damage is lessened to a great degree because everyone is far away from it. Melee are generally not going to be close enough if the range start far enough away. Now from this left position, we then, on the second demolition, wait for the first one, and then we go backwards, sort of opposite where the boss is, so out of range temporarily, so that the second one comes back in the back of the room there, and then the third one is to the right. And again, it can target someone else that happens to be on the other side, but the idea is the same. So the second set we're doing from the left side, then backwards, and then to the right. Now for the first set of demolition, or massive demolition, just going from right to left, the movement pattern is really just to mitigate damage on the raid. But for the second set, the reason we go from left, then backwards, then right, is that during the second demolition set, you will get an Impaling Throw cast on you, marked for death, and then Impaling Throw. And this can be problematic because if you have players that are targeted, depending on the timing of the throw, and they're moving all the way to the right, but the only existing debris pile that you want to hide behind is far to the left, you're going to have trouble with that. So what we found worked better was to do that on the second set from the left, then go backwards so that people that are targeted by marked for death in the second set are very close to the pile. They can just step left a few yards if needed, but otherwise just get behind that initial pile that dropped down, because that's the only one that you'll be guaranteed to have active before the throw goes out in the second round. The other thing we do is we have throws for the first set, so while we're waiting for the second demolition set, go behind the central pile that exists, if there is one, and then the second time the throw goes out, we go behind the left one that's near the raid on the left side. In this case here, they were both in the middle, so we couldn't do that. But once both those throws go out, you're waiting for the next demolition, so then here's the second one, and now we're doing the backwards thing. So now when people get a mark on them, they only have a few yards to run to get behind that first demolition pile, which is guaranteed to be active there. And don't be afraid to use cooldowns for these demolitions in this first phase. The critical thing is to have enough DPS to sort of push the boss before you get a third demolition phase. If you get a third one, it's not necessarily into the fight, but it's going to be more problematic for you to deal with that third round and all the damage that it does, as well as the lesser space that you have in the room since the slag is coming in. But don't be afraid to use cooldowns on this because you generally won't need raid cooldowns until the third phase after this. So you'll have plenty of time for the cooldown to come back up. Now for the first phase, Shattering Smash, this will generally be handled by the tank that it's targeted on, and possibly, in addition to that, a priest helper, if you have one available. The basic idea here is that the smash should only hit the tank. No one else needs to help soak it. The damage can be mitigated by that tank, by him or herself, with a personal mitigation cooldown of some sort. But the critical thing is that the knockback from this will cause the tank to fly into the molten slag on the outside of the room. And this damage ramps up very quickly, so in addition to the actual initial smash damage, can be quite deadly on the tank. The debuff that it applies does not go away, so this can sort of kill the tank in subsequent smashes if they don't have enough cooldowns or healing or whatnot. So to deal with that, you can have the tank sort of preemptively use a cooldown to help mitigate it, or you can try to use like a priest for a life grip mechanic. What's important to note is that the smash in this phase applies a stun mechanic, so the tank will be stunned, so he or she cannot sort of use a personal charge or teleport or something, since they're going to be stunned in that period. But if you have a priest available, he or she can use a life grip just after the smash knockback begins, but before the player gets out of range, to prevent them from actually hitting the slag. So we just rotated our priests to help deal with that, and it wasn't a big deal. Now, usually you're not going to have enough to do it for everyone, so we tended to do it for the later smashes. The first one or two are not necessarily going to be a big deal because neither tank will have any of the slag debuff active at that time. Now once the boss hits about 71% health, unfortunately it's not exact, he will smash the floor out from under you, do pretty heavy damage to the entire raid, and you'll all drop down and begin Phase 2. Phase 2 is easily the most challenging aspect of the entire fight. It's where you'll spend most of your time learning and wiping and all that good stuff. But we'll begin by talking about the Iron Soldiers and Balconies. Now you'll notice when you drop down into this Phase 2 area, there'll be two balconies, one to the east and one to the west. And just about right away, a series of Iron Soldiers will spawn always initially on the east balcony. These guys essentially just stay up top and will fire on random range players down below these explosive round shots. These will deal pretty heavy fire damage to the target, but more importantly, they also hit anyone within 8 yards of the targeted player. And throughout the phase, the number of Iron Soldiers that spawn over time increases. So, as you're getting to the end of the phase, you'll have so much damage incoming from the Iron Soldier shots that you just can't deal with it effectively. So you, again, kind of like the Molten Slag sort of creeping in Phase 1, the Iron Soldier shots act as a sort of very soft, but technically soft and rage mechanic of Phase 2, whereby you just cannot deal with the damage that they're putting out. Now the soldiers themselves have pretty low health, so you need to do your best to kill them off quickly. And you can do this by using the Shattering Smash that's targeted on a tank during this phase to, as mentioned before, get knocked in the direction that you want, to go to the balcony that you're trying to get to, kill off the soldiers quickly, and come back down. While you are on top of a balcony, you will take a stacking debuff called Incendiary Shot. And this essentially does fire damage every tick and increases the damage you take every stack. So you cannot stay up there indefinitely. You eventually have to drop down. So the first method that we tried to deal with this was to send up a team of melee, essentially. You have the initial tank target, who will always be knocked away, of course, a handful of melee DPS, and a healer to keep them alive. And that worked okay, but what we found is that it was overkill. It was too many people being sent up, and because the number of players that are up top doesn't really scale very well with the number of soldiers that you're going to get in the later phase, it just doesn't work. So as mentioned in the raid composition section, what we found worked best is classes that have higher on-demand burst to multiple targets, namely Balanced Druids, Death Knights, things like that. So what we did, and it worked really well, is to send up two Balanced Druids with a healer and the tank that, of course, got targeted initially. But for the most part, those two balanced druids were able to deal with the balcony by themselves. One of them using cooldowns and on the first time, and then the other balanced druid using their own cooldowns the second time and alternating back and forth. And with this method, like I said, they were able to deal with pretty much all of them on their own. And this increases the damage that you have on the main platform to such a degree that you can sort of push the phase kind of an extra round early. And we'll talk about what those rounds mean later. But if you can get a balanced druid up there, helps a lot. Like I said, other classes with good area of effect damage will work well. Death Knights are good because they may not be able to kill them quickly, but they can dot them all up, sort of, and then just they'll die over time, that kind of stuff. The second new mechanic, and easily the most important of the phase and probably the most difficult of the entire fight, are the Siegemakers. These are machines that will spawn about every 50 seconds in Phase 2, and a Siegemaker will spawn from one of the 4 gates on the outside of the room. There are 2 gates in the east and 2 to the west. Now, the gate that the Siegemaker spawns from will be determined by the furthest gate from the boss's current location. So what this means is that it's important that the tanks are doing their best to tank the boss sort of off-center on one side of the room or the other. That way, when the Siegemaker is about to spawn, the player at least, that is in charge of it, can know where the Siegemaker is going to pop out and be ready for that. Now, once the Siegemaker actually spawns, it will fixate on a single player, the player that is nearest to the Siegemaker's position after it actually spawns. It will keep fixating on this player and chasing them through the entire duration of the Siegemaker's life or the player's life. So if the Siegemaker dies, obviously it's over, but if the player dies that's being fixated on, it will fixate a new person. Otherwise, it's a permanent fixate. So you'll generally want to have one highly mobile range DPS handle this. We chose to use our hunters, and usually we have sort of one hunter on one side of the room, the east side, and one hunter on the west side. And that way, no matter which side the Siegemaker spawns on, one of those hunters will generally be available and ready to pick it up. Now, as mentioned, the actual kiting for the Siegemaker is generally going to be across paths that have the bombs on them. So the idea here is that the Siegemaker, once it spawns, will have iron plating active, which is a buff that reduces damage it takes by 90%. So initially, Siegemaker attacks are pointless. You're just going to be wasting your damage and whatnot. However, as soon as a Siegemaker touches either a bomb on the ground or an Impaling Throw actually hits it, the plating will be removed and it will take standard damage. From that point forward, it will die very quickly. A pair of Impaling Throws do a little bit over 35% health to it, so around 40% maybe, and the bombs do a huge amount as well. So the basic idea is that the timing for the Impaling Throws marked for death, along with the Siegemaker spawns, is such that you will throw 2 pairs or 2 sets of Impaling Throws into each Siegemaker, and it should die about the time that the second throw set comes out. So if you do it properly, the kiter initially picks up the Siegemaker, starts dragging it to mines. Either a bomb will hit first or the Impaling Throws on the first set will hit first, but around the same time roughly. The plating will be gone, and range DPS will start attacking it. Once the Siegemaker reaches about 35% health, stop DPS on it. You don't need any more. About that time, the second set of Impaling Throws will come out. They should both be line of sighted behind the Siegemaker, and that actual throw hit, doing full damage, will generally kill it off. And if it doesn't kill it off, it'll be low enough that you can just finish it with a little bit of damage. Now, the goal in killing the Siegemaker around the set of the second Impaling Throws is to prevent it from being alive long enough to reach 100 energy. If a Siegemaker hits 100 energy, it will cast Blaze, which targets a random raid member and essentially drops fire on their location that will spread outward very quickly. This fire, as you might imagine, is very dangerous, but more importantly, it takes up roughly 20%, say, of the space in the room, and will be a huge hindrance from that point forward in the phase, properly positioning and moving around because you have this huge sort of no-go zone of fire. So That's the general goal, is killing each and every Siegemaker around the time of that second Impaling Throw set so that it does not get enough energy to cast Blaze. Now, as mentioned, Phase 2 is by far the most difficult aspect of the fight, and so probably the most important thing that everyone in the raid should try to get used to is just constantly thinking about the possibilities of what could happen to them if they're lucky or not, and be prepared. Our biggest issue when learning this fight was just drilling into the heads of everyone in the raid that Mark for Death is about to occur, Siegemaker is about to spawn, where do you need to be standing to be ready in case it targets you, that kind of thing. Or where do the kiters need to be, or where does a tank need to pull the boss so that people can be knocked back for smash onto the balcony but not get hit by mines and yada, yada, yada. Or spreading out for the explosive shots from the balcony and all that good stuff. So the best thing you can do is just communicate frequently about the upcoming events and prepare everyone involved. Since Mark for Death is the most critical aspect of this phase, you want to do your best to always be thinking about when that's going to come out relative to the Siegemaker timing, where the Siegemakers are going to be. You'll see that we have 4 raid marks on the 4 doors that can spawn the Siegemaker, so that we can just call, all right, it's going to spawn on red like it is there, and all the range players, if they're preparing properly, will start to make their way sort of in that direction, so that if they get targeted by Mark for Death, they're close enough that they can hide behind it in time. And of course, melee and tanks need to always be on the opposite side so they don't get hit, all that good stuff. Now, preventing the blaze effect from going out from the Siegemaker, killing it around the second pair of Impaling Throws, means that because of the timing of the next Siegemaker, you will have a Impaling Throw set that comes out that is not mitigated by a machine. There's no line of sight available. So every third set of marks, and therefore Impaling Throws, has to be soaked up by players. And how you handle this is sort of up to you. We tried a few different methods. One method is just to allow the players that are targeted to soak it themselves. And we did it initially, and it works fine, but it's a lot of extra damage. Like I said, the dot from the Impaling Throw is 45 seconds. It does a huge amount of damage over that period. It just costs so much healing that you just don't really want to spend that effort on it. And it's on 2 people in that case. So even though you can immune the initial hit and the knockback, as mentioned, the dot is where the damage actually happens, and you cannot prevent that. So while it works to have players soak it individually if they're targeted, what we actually found worked better is to have our tanks soak it. So if you watch here, the 2 mark players on my left are stacking up near one another, and that way our tank that is soaking that third set, because there's no Siegemaker available, in this case our monk tank, was able to stand in line of sight of both of the throws and get hit by both of them simultaneously. This means that the tank player that got hit will have a double stack of the dot, but while it's kind of heavy damage for that player to soak, it turns out it's much easier to deal with that damage on an individual tank player than on 2 non-tank people. Overall, the actual damage that is dealt, of course, will be mitigated a great deal, since tanks have innate damage reduction. But more importantly, you're already healing the tank anyway, so you don't waste a lot of overhealing or missed globals or anything like that. So generally speaking, much, much easier to have your tanks do it, if you can. Now, as far as positioning, there's sort of a trick you can use, and it takes some practice. But if the 2 people that are targeted with Mark for the third set, so the one you're not hiding behind a Siegemaker, are not near one another, they're probably going to have difficulty getting close enough that the arrows are close enough that the tank can stand in front and soak them both. And if that's the case, players maybe are opposite each other or something, you don't really want to risk it and have someone else get hit and not get the tank hit at all or something like that. So instead, what you can do is if the mark players are sort of facing opposite directions or something, the tank that wants to soak can stand dead center underneath the boss model, and if they're positioned just right, they will be the first person hit, even though technically the throws you would think would go out from the edges of the boss. But in reality, what happens is the throw actually emanates from the center point of the boss, So if you as a tank are centered right on top of them, of the boss, you can soak those throws regardless of the direction that they're going out. Like I said, I wouldn't recommend relying on that, but in a pinch, it will work. And sometimes what will happen is you won't get both of them. One tank, or the tank will get one of them, but not the other. And so you'll have, one tank with one stack and then one random player with the other stack. And that's acceptable. Like I said, it's better to have it on both tanks, or both on one tank, but it's acceptable to have it, one tank and one random person. The last note I would make about this method, the caveat here, is to make sure you don't have both tanks get hit by throw at the same time. Because there's a knockback associated with the actual throw, impaling throw mechanic, if a knockback hits the tank that's on the boss at the time of this third pair, the boss will be moved in such a way that the upcoming Siegemaker will probably spawn in an opposite side of the room that you were planning on. And this can be very problematic for not just the Siegemaker kiters, the ranged players getting ready for mark, but also the people that are about to go up top on the balcony for the smash. So generally, you want to make sure that only one tank is hit by the knockback mechanic. So when the boss hits about 31%, again, it's not exact, the boss will smash the floor out, do very heavy damage to the raid again, and you'll fall down to the final platform where you'll finish out the fight in Phase 3. Phase 3 overall is not too complicated. There are only a few mechanics to deal with. They're not all that difficult, but it is, again, a soft rage mechanic is introduced in this case due to the space around the room, and more importantly, perhaps, it's just the damage that the raid will take. Eventually, people will start dying off, and it's kind of difficult to avoid that. So, general rule of thumb is you want to save all your bursts, cooldowns, your DPS cooldowns, your bloodlust, all that good stuff for this final phase, so you can kill the boss before you run out of room or he kills everybody in the raid. So shortly after you come down in the fight, you'll want to run the boss to the outside edge of the platform. It doesn't really matter where you go. Some people like to prefer to pick a stationary spot, but because the platform is generally just circular, it doesn't matter too much. But the first ability you'll deal with are the slag bombs. In Phase 3, you will get 3 bombs, and these are attached to 3 players. One of the bombs is attached to the current tank at the time, always. The other 2 are targeted on random raid members. And after a few seconds, these players will explode, just like the slag bombs and the rest of the fight. It will apply the slag debuff, increasing damage taken by 100% for 15 seconds to anyone within that radius. So this means, of course, the player that's actually targeted by the bomb will always get hit, and anyone else that's near them. So the method that we found to deal with this, that worked really well, essentially, is to always run the bombs out to the outside edge, and with rough positioning ideas. So the idea for us is our tank that's at the boss at the time is always just standing facing toward the center, so that the boss is facing outward like you see here. Then our tank just takes the central position. The 2 other targeted players go to either side, ideally. They all explode. They don't get any crossover damage or anything like that. And then they run back forward just a few yards. Now, Impaling Throw, marked for death, and then, of course, Impaling Throw that it actually causes, has a new capability on this phase that's very critical. And that's essentially sort of a penetration. So in previous phases, the Impaling Throw would simply hit the first person in line of sight with the targeted player, and then it would stop there. But in the last phase, it penetrates. So it will pass through any and all players in direct line with its throw trajectory. So what this means is that it's critical that marked for death players are not standing in line of sight, essentially, so in a straight line with anyone else in the raid. This essentially means that those 2 players need to move to the side of the general raid group so that when the throw hits them, they are the only person hit by that throw effect. They cannot be stacked on one another because, again, it will double up. So it will penetrate the initial person that it's targeting and hit the other person in the pair, and vice versa. So they both get 2 hits, 2 dots, bad times. So the best thing that we found to deal with this was to have the marked for death players move to the right side. The raid in general is rotating to the right, so the clockwise direction. And so we found it was best if those marked players move further in that direction to the right of the raid. So here you can see the marks going out, and those two players are moving to the right, and they'll get knocked back, take the bleed damage, take the initial hit. But the key here is by allowing them to go to the right, there isn't anything that prevents them from staying on the platform and coming back into the raid position. They won't get knocked into any existing slag pools or anything like that exist in this phase, and they'll be able to, not get knocked off. You may have seen a moment ago, one of the hunters got hit there, and he was able to use his leap to leap back onto the platform just to be safe. So this is something critical that everyone should, be prepared to use. If you have any sort of teleport or blink mechanic, and you get hit by Mark for Death, once the Impaling Throw comes out, you can just blink yourself back or whatever. So again, just like phase 2, but more frequently in phase 3, you just have to get used to the timings of everything and be aware of what's coming up, when, and call it out so people are prepared. So you just want to make sure people that are about to get marks are ready to go to the right, everyone else is ready to go to the left, so that the two players that are hit with mark are the only people affected, and so on and so forth. Now, the final base mechanic, of course, is massive Shattering Smash. So this is just like the Shattering Smash of old, previous versions. It will hit the current tank. It will deal damage split among anyone within that circle, and it will cause a knockback for the tank directly backwards and anyone else in the direction they are relative to the tank as a central point. However, because it's a massive version in Phase 3, it does a huge amount of damage. This damage scales with the number of players in the raid, but depending if you have the majority of the raid in, you can assume it's going to hit everyone for around 70,000 damage or so on heroic difficulty. The basic idea is that you want to ensure that the majority of the raid is stacked up behind the tank that's actually taking the smash, in a position that they will get knocked directly backwards, so they'll remain on the platform without getting knocked off or knocked into slag pools or anything. But enough people will be in the circle to mitigate the damage that it doesn't kill people. So that's the general idea. And you can see here we got hit by the smash. I got knocked slightly left because I was out of position. So if I were targeted by mark there, for example, I would have to quickly roll, or if I had a teleport or whatever, to the far right to make sure that it's not directly behind the raid members. So that's why it's critical that you position dead center behind the tank during these smashes so that the majority of the raid gets knocked in the same direction. And you can see sometimes people just get really off center and just get knocked clear off the platform, which is pretty bad. So what we found helped a little bit was to just essentially mark the tank with a raid mark. If you have anything to enlarge the tank's size, that will help a lot. But the basic idea is just to make sure that players can see where that tank is so that when the circle actually hits, it's going to always knock them in the direction that they intended. So the final thing to discuss for Phase 3 is general positioning, tank swaps, and cooldowns. So like I said, you initially get down here, you want to move the boss to the edge. I mentioned for positioning the bombs, we have our tank that's on the boss at the time. Just stay where he or she is and be in the outside center, and the other bombs to the side. As soon as the bomb debuff is cast, the other tank taunts. So essentially what we found worked best was to have one tank that's the bomb tank and one tank that's the smash tank. So when smash is coming up, the smash tank has the boss and faces the boss toward the raid so that everyone can stack up behind. So here our monk is our smash tank. We're stacking up behind and getting knocked away. And as soon as the smash hits, the bomb tank taunts. The bomb tank then moves the boss sort of clockwise is the direction we're going, but around the outside edge. And unfortunately, we're a little bit out of position. We should have been further right. This is just our first kill, so we're getting used to it, of course. But the idea is that we're far enough right that the slag circle that exists from the existing smash previously will not overlap with us and we'll have enough space. But anyway, the bomb tank picks up the boss as soon as the smash hits. the Smash tank, pulls the boss over to the side, faces him outward, waiting for the next bombs to come out. We drop the bombs on the outside edge. The Smash tank taunts off again, and the process repeats. Now, throughout the entire phase, you will be afflicted with overheating, which is just sort of a pulsing fire damage, a tick on the entire raid. And this increases over time, so this acts as another soften rage mechanic for the phase itself. But because of this, and because the number of marks that you get are very frequent, you'll get slag debuffs on 3 people every time. Smash damage is a lot. Just all that stuff is really adding up. There's a lot of damage in this phase. So as mentioned, you want to use all your DPS cooldowns and whatnot to burn them down, but also don't be afraid to use your healing cooldowns, survival abilities, and all that. Probably the most critical thing is to get used to the timing overlaps. The timing on abilities like Massive Smash and Marked for Death in particular are not going to be offset exactly from one another. So as the fight progresses, they'll become closer and closer together, and the timings between them, the difference between them will be offset in different periods, different lengths. What this means essentially is that for the first and second Marked for Death sets and the Impaling Throws, the players that are targeted have plenty of time to sort of get in position without too much effort. However, for the third set, and particularly the fourth, these are going to come out basically just after, and in fact during on the fourth set, during the Massive Smash knockback. So here you can see Marked for Death came out just after on the third one. So people are moving to the right, trying to get out of range of it, but it's a little bit chaotic. And because of that timing, it can be difficult to not be killed by that hit or knocked off or something like that. So don't be afraid to use cooldowns. What we found worked really well is to have a paladin use the talent that allows a double Hand of Protection cast back to back, and to essentially Hand of Protect the 2 players that are targeted with marks number 3, the set number 3, and then a different paladin, if you have one available, do it for mark set number 4. Number 4 is by far the most dangerous, so if you only have one paladin, do it on number 4. But otherwise, 3 and 4 are the most critical. Like I said, 1 and 2 are perfectly fine in standard ways. Number 5, the timing is back to essentially the second or the first set, so it's fine as well. But 3 and 4 can be a little bit problematic. Other than that, of course, use raid cooldowns on the Massive Smash knockback. You also probably want to avoid having people with the Slagged debuff, so that as the 3 people that were bombed prior to the smash from actually soaking up the smash hit. Because those people will take 100% increased damage, it is not beneficial to the raid as a whole for those people to be in the smash knockback. It will not mitigate enough damage by having 1 extra person in there, or 3 extra in this case, to the degree that someone else will die because they don't have that extra soak. Instead, you'll have to heal a great deal more damage on those people that are getting hit for twice as much from the smash itself. So generally speaking, if you have 20 people in your raid, 3 people get bombed, you should have 17 people soaking the smash, and that'll be plenty. And other than that, just do your best to rotate your cooldowns as appropriate for those smashes, and save your hops for the marks. So I think that about covers it. If you saved up your cooldowns, everyone's pretty much alive coming into this phase 3, and you just handle the positioning, the marks, the smashes, all that good stuff properly, you'll eventually kill the boss before he kills you. It's not actually that difficult of a phase overall. So I think that covers the Normal Heroic raid guide for Blackhand. I'm going to go ahead and add on a clip here of just a walkthrough going through the entire fight. It's very short, about 7 minutes. So if you want that, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, thanks for watching as always. Good luck, and I'll see you next time. Alright, so let's just walk through the fight as a whole, talk about what's going on here. So as we begin, I mentioned before that the entire range group sort of stacks up to the right, and after the initial bomb set comes out, the tank will want to move the boss away so that the slag that emanates right away doesn't explode the bombs and kill melee. Then your range group should back up sort of to max range along the right side, and then once demolition starts, once you see that orange circle, start running to the left, and you can see there that we did fine. The left demo drop will generally be on top of the group, so don't be afraid to move forward or back to avoid that. And then once the demo is done, make sure players are ready to go to the center debris pile. So if you have two in the center like we do here, then that's fine, of course. But usually you'll have one in the center and one on the left. So you want to use the use the center pile for the first Marked for Death throw, and then you'll have the second Marked for Death hide behind the left pile, where the raid is on the left. Anyway, now we have the left, yeah, that's right. Demolition starting from the left, and then we go backwards, and then we go right. Here you can see our two throw targets are able to move forward and slightly left again to hide behind that first debris that fell down. Meanwhile, the tanks and melee are moving every time there's bombs thrown out. Here's the next Mark for Death. You can see one of our hunters screws up pretty big, doesn't get positioned properly. And this is just why it's critical to always be thinking about the possibility, if I'm targeted for Mark for Death, what is going to happen? Am I going to be able to deal with it? And it's really difficult for people to get that, mentality going. Anyway, you should transition before the third demolition happens, which we do here. Immediately we offset the boss slightly toward the east side so that the first Smash players can move to the east platform where the soldiers are. And then there's a Siegemaker picked up by our hunter. Range players are getting close enough that they can get behind it from mark. You want to make sure that you are not too close to mines as the Siegemakers going over them to the bombs, because when they explode, they still do their damage within that 10-yard radius. So if you're within 10 yards, you will get hit even though you didn't trigger the mine yourself. It was the Siegemaker. And there the Siegemaker died to the second throw, which is the ideal timing, so it doesn't get its cast off. Here we have so here you can see the third set, which is double split. So we screwed that up. Both of our tanks got hit, which is completely, as mentioned, the wrong thing to do, because the smash that followed up is not able to actually hit all the people that we wanted it to. So Siegemaker spawned on the right side still, which is fine, but just something to watch for. And here we've got Fixate on our hunter again, running around. Here's the marks they're hiding behind. And now we have another third set of marks, which will be soaked. These people are close enough, they're going to stand on one another so that our tank can pick it up. So our monk tank was able to get both of them. A little bit close on one of those knockbacks, almost hit a player into a mine or in a bomb. So just watch for that. There's the next mark. Now, depending on our DPS, you'll probably get a fourth Siegemaker. And because of the offset timing, the Marked for Death comes out right around the time of that fourth Siegemaker spawn. So it's really critical that people are in position ready to hide behind where that Siegemaker is going to spawn. And as mentioned, you can tell where that's going to be based on the boss's offset position, opposite wherever he is. We also elect not to purposely attack the final Siegemaker in the phase, because it doesn't really matter if we allow it to get its blaze cast off or not. So here comes the Siegemaker. There go the marks. And often what will happen is on that fourth one, because of the timing, the Siegemaker will fixate on one of the people that was marked, depending if your kiter is able to get close enough or not. And if that's the case, it's okay, because the phase is going to end soon, so it doesn't matter too much. Anyway, we enter phase 3 with everyone alive, which is pretty crucial. It means you have a good chance. Here are bomb tank or paladins facing the boss away. Gets the bomb on the outside. Marks are going off to the right, which is ideal. It's perfect. So just those two people are hit and knocked back. Here's the smash. Just about everyone stacked up going backwards. And then there's our paladin tank, our bomb tank, taunting again. So as mentioned, you can see he's a little bit close there, but he starts to adjust to make sure we have enough room, which is fine there. There goes the bombs. The marks. And yeah, the timing on phase 3 is pretty fast. Things just happen very rapidly, but you just have to watch what's happening next, or the next 2 or 3 things, and prepare accordingly. Next smash, you can see I got off-centered there a bit. There's the third set of marks. We're bopping those people, and that works great. You can see they don't get knocked away. So they will still get the dot, of course, but it prevents them from being knocked off the edge accidentally. And there's the bombs. And still, I think everyone's alive. And this is the critical marks there. So we got another bop. I think one of those marks hit a few people because we weren't exactly knocked the right direction. Not everyone was knocked backwards or slightly left. So you just got to watch for that. But otherwise, enough people are alive at this point that it's going to be difficult to screw it up. Just don't get everyone hit by a bomb or a mark or something. You'll be fine. Yay! All right. So yeah, like I said, really short fight overall, but quite challenging, a lot of fun. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Good luck, and see you next time. You know, a way you could really smash your way into my heart is hitting that subscribe button. It would just make me feel all warm and fuzzy. Maybe slag all over myself. Perhaps.